In the previous video, we saw how we can use different layouts for the lines in the grid. Now we will study, for each control, the possibility of varying its type so that it looks and behaves in a way different than the predefined manner. The types will depend on the control involved, its data type, and on whether it's read-only or not. We'll start with the grid control, showing you an example. A transaction was created to provide the event's participants with a list of nearby restaurants offering discounts, called restaurant. If we do not want the grid that implements the list of restaurants to appear in the standard manner, but rather with locations shown on a map, since we have the geographical location, meaning latitude and longitude of each restaurant in an attribute of the data type semantic domain geolocation, then we can change the grid's control type and select, from among all the types offered, the SD maps. Similar to what happened when we tapped on the line of the standard list, when we now tap on the map's pin, the element selected will be shown exactly as the row is specified on the grid. And when we tap on it, the default action will be called. If no modification was made, then it'll be the detail in view mode. Let's see this in GeneXus. Here we have the restaurant transaction and its attribute of the geolocation type. Let's view the pattern, the list node, the grid, with the empty control type. Let's see it in runtime prior to changing the control type. We can see that it appears as a classical list. Now we do the change. Let's see all the possibilities that the control type offers, which include SD maps. When we select it, we open a set of properties, which include the property called location attribute, appearing with this icon, which indicates a warning about the need to specify the attribute that contains the longitude and latitude. In our case, this attribute is restaurant geolocation. We then have more properties to customize the way in which the map will be shown. For instance, the type, if it's standard, satellite, or hybrid, etc. We now press F5. And we can see that now the restaurants are shown as dots on the map. If we now tap on a dot, we will see the data from the line. What data? The one we have in the grid. The restaurant's photo and name. And if we tap on this data's element, we will see that it's calling the detail. Something to consider. To use Google Maps in an Android application, we must have a Google API key. If we don't have one, then the maps will not be shown when the SD Maps control type is used. By default, the application generated will use an RTEX signature to sign the application that also allows the use of Google Maps because it has to be the same one. If you're signing the application with your own signature, key store, you will also need to specify that signature in order to use Google Maps. In our wiki, you will find out how to do it obtaining the API key. It'll show you how to do it in just a few easy steps. In sum, for a grid, the control type indicates the special way in which each item or element on that grid will be shown and used. The properties deployed for configuration will depend on the type selected. Now we will just see some more of these types in applications during production. For example, the horizontal grid. It's used in the final application that we're using as a model. There, we will see how a session's speakers are shown as a horizontal grid, where each item on the grid is shown as a column. Here, the setting is for the page size to be 3 for portrait and also 3 for landscape. This means that 3 lines will be loaded, columns or items per page, and we will need the horizontal scroll to view the following page. Here we can also see that it was decided to omit the controller. Let's see more control types for grids in use. You may skip this part if you wish. We start with the Find My Plane application. Here we enter a flight number and a date. And in addition to airport data on departures and arrivals, the status is also shown, in flight at the moment. If we press to view the flight on the map, we will see 3 dots: the departure airport, the airplane, the flight, and the arrival airport. These are 3 geographical points returned by a service that is consumed by the application. In sum, it's a grid with 3 items that is shown using the SD Maps control type. Now let's take a look at the Metro DF application designed for the subway of Mexico City. Here we can see all the subway stations on a map, including all the metro lines. It is then a grid, whose items are the stations, which are shown on a background image that is an abstraction of the city map. Each item contains a pair of X and Y coordinates that define the location on the image, where a pin represents the element. The grid is then using the SD image map control type. The grid's items are located on a background image according to their X and Y coordinates. And here, below, we see all the subway lines. It's a grid whose elements are these lines, with an image representing each of them. This grid is shown by using the SD horizontal grid type, with a single row and 8 columns per page. On the other hand, if we select a line, such as line 3 for example, we will be able to view all the stations included in it. It's also a grid of the horizontal type with 2 columns and 7 rows per page. Now, regarding the first grid, we can select the station where we want to depart at the subway, and our destination station. We can request the application to calculate the 5 best routes to complete the itinerary. The first route found includes lines 5 and 9. And we can see that, on a background image, the subway map, it loads the dots that represent each station along that route as X and Y coordinates on the background image. This is to say that a grid will be loaded whose items are the stations along that route with their coordinates on that background image. So, the grid's type is image map. Technically, when we requested the 5 best routes, it executed a calculation algorithm of the best routes, which resulted in loading a collection SDT with 5 items. Each item is in turn a collection with the subway lines of each of those routes found. So what we see here is then a grid of the paged grid type. That is to say, a grid showing a single element per page. What happens is that each element is a collection SDT with the lines of that route. So there's a grid nested in the first grid. Also note that every time that we change pages, the image map grid is loaded again with the stations along that route. And the horizontal grid showing each station in the order from origin to destination is loaded again as well. And now let's see the application for the Mexican TV channel, TV Azteca. Specifically, we are in the presence of a table with the program scheduled. It shows information in 2 dimensions with horizontal and vertical scroll. This is a grid for which we have to define what will appear on the x-axis, the start time of shows, and on the y-axis, days of the week, with their widths and lengths where each element, each show, determines its x and y position, as well as its size, aspect, and information to be shown. We can also indicate that the row we've selected be shown in a specific manner. All of this is done by using the SD matrix grid control type for the grid. Properties will be deployed to configure all the aspects mentioned. These are the predefined types for the grid control, but you may also import user controls developed by yourself or others to be used in the same way. You'll find further information on these and other control types here in our wiki. Here you will find an example of each. Just as a grid may be shown in different ways, the same happens with attribute or variable controls. where the types offered will depend on the control. From the Work With restaurants, we decide to view the detail of one and then edit it. Here we see how we can make the user enter a rating, with stars, for the value of a numeric attribute that takes values up to 5, with degrees increasing by 1. Let's see it in GeneXus. We have the restaurant transaction with the restaurant rating attribute, a numeric of 1. If we go to the pattern and the general section in the edit screen, and we then edit the attribute's properties, we will come upon the control type property, which has a default value, edit. This means that in runtime, and we edit the detail of a restaurant, the field will be edit. If we want little stars, we must change the control type to one that is offered by the combo, one specific for smart devices, called SD rating. We will see these two properties open up, where we must define which will be the maximum value and which will be the steps between one and the other. Let's try this change, F5. We can see that, in view mode, it continues to appear as an edit. But if we now edit the restaurant, we get the stars. Let's now change it to 3 stars. We save. And now we get 3. As mentioned, the types offered depend on the control's data type. So, if we go to the view screen and to the control corresponding to the image of the restaurant, we will see that the default control type is image. And it also offers the possibility of changing it to advanced image, which will allow zooming and even copying the image to clipboard. We might also want to add the attribute, restaurant rating, to the list. And here we also modify first the label, and then the control type. But this time, instead of edit, we want it also to be shown as SD rating. F5.
Aquí lo
And we can
vemos.
see it here. So, attributes and variables may be entered when they're not read-only. Those that are read-only may be shown using other controls apart from the default ones. We can see some of these types in published applications. Here we have an application developed for a chain of supermarkets. We search by category, fresh fruit, and here we see all the products in the selected category on a horizontal grid. We decide to view a product, and here's the information on it. And here, in another horizontal grid, we have all the related products. And we can see how the images allow us to zoom. This means that its type is advanced image. Another option to search for a product is to type its name here, or also scan its barcode. For example, I've run out of the product and I want to order more. We could do that from here. It's used on a variable, and the control type is SD scanner. Here we can see an application to control body weight, peso book. Here I have my objective, which is my target weight. And here I can view the weights I've entered so far. I will now enter a new weight. Today, my weight is this. This is a numeric attribute which has SD wheel instead of the edit control. I save, and I can see the body mass index, which is also numeric. But instead of being shown as an edit, it's shown within a range. It uses the SD linear gauge control type. I might also want to view a graph of my body weight over time. So, for a grid control, we also have the SD charts control. You can find more on this here. We've studied the possibility of changing the control type to achieve a specific appearance and behavior different from what's predefined. In the next video, we will particularly see the detail node of the work with object, and we'll study how different sections are shown